Hey everyone, thanks for joining me. I'm Rick, and today we have another DAC. We're looking at the Doak Audio Q11. And I'd like to thank Doak Audio for loaning me a review sample. I've been testing the Q11 out for about a month now, and it'll be going back in a couple days. Today I'll start with specs, because the Q11 has an interesting selling proposition. We start off with two DAC chips, but not of the same make nor one per channel. You can select between two different DAC chips to send your signal from. One AKM4493 and one ESS Sabre ES9038 Q2M. And the Q11 is capable of handling PCM files up to 32-bit 384 kHz and DSD to DSD 256. The output voltages do differ though, the ESS chip outputting the more standard 2 volts and the AKM outputting 1.8 volts. And we'll talk about this more later. Let's take a look at the unit first. The build quality is super solid. I really think Doak upped their game on this one with the curved sides and a beautiful clear panel up on top where you can look down into the circuit board. You also have a blue LED light that illuminates the circuits. And that LED can be turned off as well as the LEDs on the front panel. On the front, in the center, an encoder that when turned controls the volume. It powers the unit on with a short press and powers down with a long press. And while it's on, short presses cycle through your inputs. There are two small screens to the sides of the encoder. The screen on your left shows the selected input, the sample rate, and the volume. The screen on your right shows the DAC mode. Mode 1 outputs the ESS chip on output 1 and the AKM chip on output 2. Mode 2 outputs the AKM chip on both output 1 and 2, while Mode 3 outputs the ESS chip on both outputs 1 and 2. The unit itself lacks a DAC mode selection button, which I think was a poor design choice. The only way to change the DAC mode is with the included remote control. And I do believe that those two DACs on this unit are its main selling feature, so it really should have had a dedicated button on the front. On the back of the unit, from the left, your analog outputs, output 1 on RCA and 3.5mm stereo, and output 2 on the same, RCA and 3.5mm stereo. I don't think the 3.5s are necessary, but they don't hurt anything. Then we have our digital ins, coaxial, Toslink optical, and USB-B. And a reminder, if you want to play any files with a higher resolution than 24-bit 192, you'd want to use that USB input. And finally, a DC barrel plug for the 12-volt 1.5 amp included power supply. So back to the output voltages, which by the way definitely made it more difficult comparing these DACs as I had to normalize the volume with preamps. I reached out to Doak to ask them a few questions, and here's what they had to say. But I do have to say first that while Doak Audio is a smaller company, Doak has always been very open with me asking them questions. And they've always been very transparent with their answers. And they've also always gotten back to me within a few days, which I very much appreciate and respect. So first, why the decision to go with two different output voltages? And they state, we can design them to be the same output, but didn't do that, since our engineer thought that the DAC Q11 is designed to show the original styles of two different popular DAC chips, so they didn't modify the output to make them the same. Now I would suggest that making them the same output would make it much easier for the end user to be able to compare those two DAC sounds without having to hook up two preamps. Nonetheless, that's what they chose to do. I also asked them that if these DAC chips share the same clocks, and this answer was no. The ESS chip uses a fixed 100 MHz clock, whereas the AKM DAC uses an embedded clock on the front end of the USB driver. And my final question was, what filters were chosen for each of these DACs? And on the ESS chip, that's the appetizing fast roll-off filter, which is the default for the 9038 Q2M, and I think it's a great choice. That's the one that I tend to use. As for the AKM chip, that one uses their short delay sharp roll-off filter. And the reason I asked them these questions was to see if we were really comparing apples to apples. And what it looks like is that what we have here in this unit is a chassis with two different DACs, and not necessarily a DAC using two different DAC chips, if that makes sense. Now these two DAC chips work very differently, so it might have been more difficult to send them through the same clock, but that would have given us an idea of what real changes are going on, as opposed to having other little components influence the sound a little bit different. But how do they end up sounding? To my ear and in my system, the DAC Q11 with the AKM chip sounds super close to the SMSL SU1. And as for the ESS side, it's very close to the Doak U8, which uses dual 9038s. So to achieve that sound quality with just the one chip, that's awesome. It doesn't quite match up to the PS200, which uses a 9039. That one tends to be a little bit crisper and clearer with a little more layer separation. But at this price point, I think it's an excellent sound. Definitely pricier than the PS200, but remember that's a pure DAC, where in this case you also get a preamp as well. Same thing goes for the SMSL SU1, just a pure DAC, no digital preamp on that one either. Now when comparing the AKM and the ESS in this configuration here, the sound was pretty similar. You can make out the differences, but they're very, very slight. And you'd have to be in a quiet environment with fairly good pairing components. To me at least, they were close enough where I wouldn't even bother picking one over the other after playing with them for a couple days. They both sound great, but there's not a giant difference. Generally speaking, great sound for the price, nice clarity, the bass doesn't appear thin, and the mids and highs aren't harsh. The AKM tends to be slightly softer and a little more relaxed, whereas the ESS slightly more detailed with a little more energy. I do think for its asking price of $159, it's right in line. I personally would have loved to have seen this particular case with the little window, the volume encoder, and this chassis with only one DAC, and I wouldn't have cared which one. But something like that at $129, that would have been a killer value. And I think that unit might have had more appeal. My conclusion is I don't really think this is a mainstream product. I can see a lot of beginners into the DAC world getting confused or frustrated when they hook this up to an entry-level system and don't hear very much difference between the DACs except for the drop in volume output. But if you're a tinkerer or DIYer, I can definitely see the appeal. I think it's a great experiment, and I applaud Doak for the novel approach. And again, I definitely do think it does perform at its asking price. Just don't get fooled into thinking that you really are getting two distinctive DAC flavors. If you want to give your music a little distinctive flavor, get an EQ, like the awesome Doak T8 Pro, which is a tube-based EQ, or the T7, which is Doak solid state. So that's all I have for you guys on this one. Thanks for watching, and see you on the next one.